Hello there, very warm welcome. I'm Julie MacDonald. In a time of economic challenges, unstable geopolitics, compromised data, disinformation, AI, supply chain disruption, and a somewhat disillusioned workforce, how can businesses create growth and keep risk at acceptable levels? Well, let's welcome Steve Durbin from the Information Security Forum. Hi there, Steve. Fantastic to see you. I always enjoy our conversations. So much is in flux right now. What I would like to understand from you is how can a business create a culture that is about supporting risk management, cybersecurity, but also about driving growth? How do they get the balance right?
I think with difficulty is the short answer. I think every business these days is dependent upon technology. And so if you're dependent upon technology, you have to take into account cybersecurity and the risks that brings. So how do you go about doing it? I think it's about alignment. I think you have to really look at it from a corporate standpoint in terms of what are we trying to do? What is the strategic direction for the company? And then focus in on those things that are going to make a difference to achieving that. And really make sure that that is protected then from a security standpoint, from a risk perspective. But there's no easy answer to it. And risk, I've sort of come to the conclusion, is a very personal thing when you look at it from a corporate standpoint. So lots of people will talk about, standardizing, and these are the things you ought to do, or this is the percentage you ought to spend, and so on. And so it's all about tailoring that risk profile in line with your board, in line with your leadership team, in line with what you're trying to achieve.
I'm glad you mentioned the leadership team. So much of this is about the skills of the leader, isn't it? To bring all of those teams on board. And I notice very much in my work also, particularly with large corporates, there are a lot of silos. But it strikes me that in managing risk, it's about collaboration, it's about working together. So the CEO has a huge role to play here, don't they, in getting those teams on board and understanding the value of managing that risk?
Yeah, the CEOs do, and I think it's the whole leadership team as well, and I would include the board in that. But I think, when we look at any business, again, one of the things that has struck me is that we talk so much about technology, but actually it's all about the people. And so high emotional intelligence, the ability to try to head things off before they happen, understanding the challenges of different teams working together. I think successful businesses were going to have to be very much more transparent than perhaps they have been in the past, not just within leadership, but also throughout the organisation. Because you have to be able to make sure that everybody who is involved understands why they're doing what they're doing. And I think for some chief executives, for some leadership teams, that's proving to be difficult. Coming out of COVID, for instance, and I'm always a little bit bothered about harking back to those days, but I think there were significant changes in the business environment, in the business culture, that are important for us to understand. Coming out of that, I think there was a tendency for companies to knee-jerk react and say, right, you've now got to do as we were before, without taking into account the fact that the whole environment had changed significantly. People had changed significantly. And so when I look at businesses all around the world, the most successful ones that I see have really got that. And they've decided that they need to do something around, not necessarily transformation, because for me that always really makes me think about revolution, but how they can evolve the overall people-based culture in line with what the business is trying to achieve, in line with what shareholders are expecting, in line with the ambitions of certain individuals, in an environment that's become very much more complex, where people are still, frankly, struggling to come to terms with what this new environment looks like.
You mentioned transparency, and I find this interesting because I'm also thinking about cross-fertilisation across an industry, or with regulators, or with government. So that transparency going beyond just the inside of an organisation, but going beyond its borders.
Yeah.
And that is something I feel that a lot of people, a lot of organisations struggle with, this idea that they might have to collaborate with competitors in order to be able to deal with threats. So how far does transparency need to go?
Yeah, I think again it's going to be dependent upon the industry that you're in, the company that you're in, the stage of maturity of that organisation. If I look back at security, if I go back, say, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, security was never seen as providing some form of competitive advantage. And so there was a willingness, I think, among security professionals to share hugely. I'd never seen anything like it when I came into the industry 15 years ago. That has changed. So I think that if you were to go and ask a CEO today, what are the elements of competitive advantage, he or she would probably point to security being one of them, depending on the industry that they're in, of course. So I think that has changed, and that has an impact then on transparency. It has an impact on regulators. If you're in the financial services space, you're highly regulated. Interestingly, you're probably sharing a tremendous amount of information. So we're starting to see, I think, an evolution, not just of the regulator, because regulators are traditionally going to be slightly behind the game, but also of government bodies. So again, I'm thinking particularly of people like the NCSC in the UK or NIST in the United States, for instance, and some of the others across Europe, where they are actively trying to collaborate, trying to understand what it is that future direction of threat looks like.
So would you say that there's more a proactiveness now there between all of these different organisations to lead rather than to react?
I think they're getting there. I don't think they will ever achieve that position, but I think they have realised that sitting in a silo isn't going to work. There has to be some form of outreach.
Where do you see the changing regulatory landscape and the burden that falls from it? Where does it fall in an organisation? Is it on legal, risk and compliance? And how are those functions coping with the fact that regulation is in flux, especially if you're a global business and you're doing business across borders?
It is, and where does it sit? Well, ultimately, of course, it sits with the chief executive and the board of directors. They're responsible for those things legally. But you make an interesting point. I mean, the burden of regulation is something that I've talked about for some while now, and it does concern me. Because if you're a large organisation, you do have the resources available to keep abreast of what's going on. If you're a mid-size, you're going to struggle. If you're a small enterprise, you stand no chance at all. And of course, all of those companies are interconnected in the supply chain. So there's an increasing onus, I think, on large corporations to actually take a much more mature view on the supply chain. And instead of simply asking them to complete questionnaires to comply, it's about helping them to do so. It's about explaining why it's necessary. Because a small enterprise can be a very important cog in that supply chain wheel. And so it isn't a simple question or matter of just excluding them. So we have to, again, collaborate, be transparent, and actually help.
Where leaders of organisations come into play, and particularly those that are leading cybersecurity, are they doing as good a job as they could of explaining the strategic imperative to getting it right?
Ooh, that's a question. I think yes and no. I think, they've got better. So let's start with the good stuff first. They've got better. But there is still this challenge. And again, one of the things I've noticed is that we speak two different languages. So the language of the business is not the same as the language of technology and security. And so then if we're not very careful, we get into this debate about, well, whose responsibility is it to learn to speak each other's language? And the answer, of course, is it's both of us. But I think for security people, what they have to be better at is understanding the role that security plays in achieving the business objectives, the business strategy. Because if they can do that, then suddenly they have the ear of the business. On the other side, from the business perspective, they need to understand the role that technology plays in achieving what they're trying to do. Because technology equals security equals risk. And so I think if we can start to really look at those two facets, then we're in a much, much better position than we were. But there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done, and it's not simple. It's not a simple fix.
How important is being able to communicate everything that you've just said to the human parts of the business? I was at a closed door security meeting last year, and I noticed that in every question that element was there. How do we marry the human element with the technology? How do we explain why it's important? Because in a lot of the case studies I was seeing there was still that human element, mistakes, phishing, scams, all of that kind of lower level stuff. And so how do we go about telling the story that it's everybody's responsibility driving towards those business outcomes to take care of security?
I think that's a key point. It is everybody's responsibility. If you look at the way in which now technology is all pervasive, we use different elements of technology to do our jobs. So we may be doing something on our own mobile phone, for instance, which we wouldn't have been doing before. So the importance of security awareness has actually increased significantly. Again, we have hybrid working in the majority of organizations. And so it is about tailoring your awareness programs to be relevant to the individual. What you're trying to do is to get some emotional connection between the individual and what it is that you're trying them to do or not to do. And that means that, yes, of course, there is training. Yes, of course, there needs to be scenarios where you're running, phishing exercises and all of that kind of thing. But the important point for me that I think a lot of organizations forget is that you have to provide feedback, good and bad, in the moment. So it is no good me clicking on a link and in a week's time you coming to me and saying, Steve, well, 7 days ago, you actually clicked on this link and you shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
Because I've got no clue what you're talking about. Whereas if you can get me in the moment, flash something up on the screen, explain to me what I should have done, I'm going to remember that. The other key thing that I don't think we do enough of, and it's really simple, is just let people know who to contact if they're uncertain. We know that a significant amount of phishing takes place, via email. And with the best will in the world, at some point, somebody will see something. And it irritates me no end when I talk to people and they say, well, I didn't know what to do about it. Because that is a really simple fix. It's got nothing to do with technology. It's got everything to do with basic security and good communication. So I think concentrate on the basics, because they will take us a heck of a lot further than all of the complex stuff that technology vendors would have you believe are more important.
When we get into the more complex areas of cyber security and we think of scenario planning, predicting and preventing, how are large organizations, you support some of the largest, most successful organizations in the world, so how are they going about doing this, and can those kind of ways of planning be reproduced at smaller scale?
Yes, they can, is the good news. So how do they go about doing it? Well, probably the most popular service that we've been providing over the last, I would say, 18 to 24 months has been cyber simulation exercises, where we do take certain scenarios and we start in the boardroom. So again, it's all about that alignment from the top of the company. So we start in the boardroom, we run the exercise for the board. It isn't about simply doing tabletops. It is live. We do throw different things at individuals that they have to respond to. And then we go down from there. So typically in an organisation, we'll be running a number of these, board level, senior leadership, and then down into middle management and amongst employees as well. And it's all about taking those learnings and doing something constructive with it. So yes, of course, you're testing the business continuity planning element of things, but you're also unpicking how good certain individuals might be in a moment when you're probably going to depend on them. And you'll also highlight those that perhaps aren't quite as good. So you're throwing up, training needs, training opportunities, and I think that certainly the feedback we've had from all of the members that we've been doing this work with is that it goes so far beyond what they had anticipated or expected, because everybody's used to this tabletop stuff, and that I think is obviously good. The other element of it is that, which I like particularly, is they tell me it's fun. And it has to be fun.
Yes.
Because if it's fun,
yep,
you remember it. And I think we need to bring a bit more fun back into work, because it's got dreadfully dull.
It's interesting that you mentioned the word fun, and we've talked a lot about the human-centred part of work, about cyber security. I'm going to jump from that straight into AI, which has its roots in human capabilities,
Yeah.
but it is becoming commonplace in every workplace or in a lot of workplaces, but it brings with it deep risks and complexities. How do you see the AI era, let's say in the short term, developing, and how proactively are organizations getting ready for it?
Yeah, I mean, AI, it's not new. I think that's the first thing that I always say to people. Machine learning has been around for quite some while. What has happened is that it's become very much more prevalent and in your face, if you like. AI depends on data. Data integrity is hugely important. AI is getting better at being able to spot data problems, but if you've got good data, that's really where you need to be starting with AI. And there are a lot of our member organisations that have done some pretty impressive things with that, not just in the security space, but outside of that as well, in the whole sort of predictive area. I'm thinking about retailers, consumer-based organisations, banks, because they can be used from a threat intelligence perspective as well. But again, the organisations for me that are really getting it right have not seen AI as this big solution. What they've seen it as is a tool. So again, AI is good at doing certain things. People are good at doing other things, the creative element of it. Yes, AI can produce paintings and pictures and write books, but it's not quite the same, and you can usually spot it. And it's the same in a work environment. AI is very good at spotting things that are abnormal. So let's use it to do that, because nobody wants to be sitting there looking at all of these network scans. So get the human working with the AI, use the best of the people with the AI. And bear in mind that when it all comes crashing down, there isn't a piece of technology in the world that will get your systems back up and running. And so don't forget the role that people have to play. So look after the people, make sure that they understand the important role that they have, because I think all too often we talk about them being the weakest link. Actually, they're the strongest link. And I think there is a tendency with AI to just forget that it is just a bit of technology, it is just a tool, and people are still the key component in all of this, making it work.
It has a job to do, but it's not the whole dish, is what I'm hearing from you. I want to talk now about geopolitics. I mean, this is an incredible period in time that we're holding our conversation here. Incredible year for democracy, but it also means that markets are in flux. The threats and vulnerabilities are changing day to day. How are organizations preparing themselves for that? Because I think this is a period that we haven't seen before, certainly in terms of markets anyway.
No, that's true. There's a tremendous amount of change, and as we know, markets hate change, businesses hate change. Some people take advantage of that and obviously come out as winners. But as a rule, we would rather be able to predict the future just a little bit, and it's difficult to do that. So what are organisations doing? Well, certainly if I look at the ISF, look at our members, they're certainly communicating more amongst themselves. We have this closed environment, as you know. So members are sharing issues that they're concerned about. If you had to say what the areas of strategy are that they're most concerned about, how would you sum them up right now? I think certainly, again, depends on the industry, but advanced threats. We are seeing an uptick in nation-state-backed threat. Obviously, if you mention the geopolitical situation from an election standpoint, election tampering, that's a big concern. But our members certainly are very conscious that with all of that going on, they still have to focus on what it is that they do. And our members are banks, and they're equally retailers, and they're equally small organisations that are in the manufacturing space, for instance. So it's a very, very wide spectrum. And they're all concerned about preserving integrity of data. They're all concerned about how they might get back up and running when something happens, because it is a case of when. It's never a case of if, it's always when. And doing all of that when they've got people like me who are pushing them to continue to grow, to continue to expand, to do things differently, to be more agile, to be more, expansive in what they're up to. So it's tricky. Protecting supply chains is another spicy area, isn't it? We've seen, obviously, over the last year and a half,
with the situation in Ukraine as it developed, we've been able to see in real time vulnerabilities across the world, COVID as well, in supply chains playing out. Has that strengthened the understanding around vulnerabilities in supply chain, or are we still only at the beginning of that conversation?
I think it has. I think that if you look at the supply chain, the way that I think organisations used to assess the vulnerability of supply chains was by categorising them. And the understanding that you need to have other options, I think, is now very prevalent amongst most organisations. So they may well have got a bigger pool of suppliers because you don't actually know, and certainly the Russian invasion of the Ukraine really brought this one home. You don't know when your suppliers may no longer be available for a variety of different reasons. And so that's really accentuated that. And one of the things that, from an ISF perspective, that we've seen is our members making very much more use of our supplier tools, supplier assessment tools, because it does give them the ability to tailor that to a very specific supplier without having to send out these pretty endless questionnaires that are inundating and frankly stifling most organisations. You know, you can be doing business with 5 organisations, you'll get 5 heavy-duty questionnaires to complete, all asking similar questions, and yet nobody is collaborating to try to ease the burden. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do that through our supplier assessment tool, which again is all about trying to make things easy for both parties. Of course, I'm not going to suggest for 1 minute that you don't do proper due diligence. Of course you do. But let's try and make it a little bit easier and share some of those things, because it's a never-ending process. You know, I could assess you today and tomorrow something will have changed. So again, it's about thinking about what makes most sense. We're back to risk, which is where we started.
Yep.
And doing sensible things on a sensible basis, but trying to make life easy as well.
When we think about the ISF and collaborations that you have, connections, relationships with governments, regulators and so on, how important do you see those relationships being going forward in supporting your members?
I think they will always be important for us. I mean, we've been doing it for 30 odd years, so I think one of the basic premises of the ISF was always about, you know, how do we help people like ISO, for instance, or how do we work with governments in different countries through their national organisations, the NCSC or NIST, you know, I've mentioned as well. So I think that that has to continue. I think that we are somewhat uniquely positioned because we are not aligned with any organisation, whether it be a vendor organisation, whether it be a government organisation. We don't lobby, for instance. So we're there to provide just objective information and to share that. And we tend to pull all of that together into this thing that we have called our standard of good practice, which provides our members with the ability to understand better what some of the regulatory or government-based requirements might be in certain countries and link that back to the policies that they're trying to put in place. And then that flows through into all of the tools and research that we do as well. So our job is to try to make life easy. That's what we're there to do. And I think that that means it's quite a difficult job.
I was going to say, making complexity easy. I want to conclude by talking about leadership. You're the leader in your organisation in very complex times, and you're also helping to support leaders in organisations in complex times. What should a leader's key priorities be? Where should their strategic focus be? When we think about risk and security right now, where does that begin? Yeah.
I think, again, you know, I would probably go back to COVID, because I think that was a really good rehearsal for the future, for where we are today. So what I mean by that is you very often need an event to shine a light on something that you need to do. So what happened during that? Well, I think about it from an ISF standpoint. You know, our primary objective was making sure that our people were safe and still had jobs. I think that is the responsibility of any leader in an organisation. We then just make sure that our stakeholders and shareholders also are getting what they needed. And I'd include customers in that, because the ISF is somewhat unique in that our members are also our customers, are also our shareholders. And I think you have to focus on those two things. Then you have to preserve the organisation going forward, because that's what continues to provide livelihoods for your people, what continues to provide product and services to your customers. And you focus on all of those. And then you come to the what-if situation. Then you begin to look at risk. And for me, you have to look at... the risk landscape has become so complex, you cannot possibly hope to cover off all eventualities. So you have to focus on the crown jewels. That's your starting point. Very often people will say to me, well, how much should we be spending? And my answer to that is it depends. It depends on your risk profile. It depends how nervous you are. It depends if you're going to enter new markets. It depends if you're coming out of markets. So you have to, as the leader of an organisation, I think, juggle all of those things. And you have to do it in a very sort of swan-like way.
While remaining flexible in your mindset, running your business at the same time. I mean, that's an incredible workload, isn't it, for a progressive CEO these days to deal with all of that?
It is, and I think, that you also have to accept that you're going to get it wrong. And when I talk to other CEOs, some of them are a little bit concerned about that. But you're going to make mistakes. So for as long as you're afraid of making those mistakes, you're never going to be giving your best. You have to give yourself the freedom, surround yourself with the right advisors, particularly when it comes to risk, of course, but recognise that you're not perfect. You will make mistakes. And the mistake itself isn't important. What is important is how you recover from that and how you learn from it going forward, and how you share that with other people in your organisation, and how you become very much more agile to take advantage of some of the opportunities that might open up. So I think it is a difficult job. But, it's a job like all the rest, and you need to make sure that you can enjoy it, have fun with it, and do something that's a bit different.
I've written down here 2 P's and 2 E's. Predict, prevent, evolve, and embrace.
Yeah.
Which I think sums up a lot of our conversation. Steve, thank you so much. I'm always fascinated talking to you as the shifting sands of geopolitics, AI, data, everything changes. So thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.